If China had never been threatened by the powerful weapons of the West, this kingdom of heaven in the 19th century would never take the thoughts and system of the barbarians seriously. The first Chinese to notice the democratic system in the West was Lin Zexu, who gave an order for his staff to translate books on parliamentary systems in the West. At that time, the British Parliament was translated as Yamen. It was obvious that for the Chinese at that time, Parliament was just another government office. And they could not understand the democratic thinking behind this institution. After all, for the Chinese, democracy was a bizarre concept. In Chinese, the traditional meaning of Minju was ruler of the people, but the word democracy actually means ruled by the people. The connotations of the two terms are completely different. Hence, when Minju was first used to refer to democracy, the translation was heavily criticized. This is because it violated traditional Chinese thinking, which held that the emperor is the ruler of the people. Having the people rule themselves was a concept beyond the imagination of the Chinese people. Intellectuals in China who wanted to bring in the democratic thinking of the West decided to use traditional thought as a cover to make these foreign concepts more acceptable to the people. Traditionally, in China, of the people was a concept that already existed. So the Chinese intellectuals could easily connect the idea of the people when they learned about democratic thinking and the democratic system. Kang Youwei and Tan Sitong started to use Confucian thought to promote political reform. They argued that Confucianism, used to support authoritarian monarchy, was actually fake. The true Confucianism would favor reform. To make it easier for the Chinese to understand, intellectuals like Wang Dao explained democracy as following the example of ancient Chinese rulers who gave the crown to the next person capable of ruling the country. King Yao gave his crown to Shun. King Shun gave his crown to Yu. They all chose to pass their crowns to someone with competence instead of their own sons. For the Chinese people in the 19th century, democracy in the United States was another way for the king to abdicate and pass the crown to someone else. George Washington was president for 8 years and then resigned. He was another Yao or Shun in the West. Some people might find the Chinese interpretation of democracy in the 19th century amusing. However, through publications and newspapers, in the late 19th century, democratic thinking gradually began to spread. The period from the late 19th century to the early 20th century was a time when Chinese thinking changed dramatically. Western European thought took several centuries to evolve to this point, but the Chinese took only a few decades. In 1896, opinion leader Liang Qichao wrote an article arguing that the Western countries were strong because they had a parliamentary system. Intellectuals who worried about the future of the country believed that democracy was a new way to save the country. 1905 was an important year in the contemporary history of China. Intellectuals appealed for a constitution and a parliament, and the conservative Empress Dowager Cixi was forced to make changes. In 1905, Japan defeated Russia. For some, this not only proved that Asians could defeat Europeans, it also meant that constitutional Japan was stronger than autocratic Russia. When Japan defeated Russia, People in China started to support the adoption of a constitution. Also in 1905, various revolutionary groups in China formed the Chinese Revolutionary Alliance in Tokyo to put together their forces. Constitutionalists wanted to keep the monarchy, but to add a constitution, a parliament, and a cabinet. Revolutionaries wanted to overthrow the emperor and build a republic with an elected president. One was moderate with slow-acting impact. The other was radical with swift impact. The constitutionalists appeared to have greater influence, but their scope of political reform was limited by the monarchy. The revolutionaries, on the other hand, had no such limitations. The two camps debated fiercely in newspapers for several years. They argued about possible instability during a revolution and about the necessity to overthrow the Qing government. They also discussed whether the Chinese people were ready for democracy. For the people, however, the key issue was whether or not to keep the monarchy. Most people were inclined to blame the Qing emperor for their suffering. Hence, the revolutionaries spread the word that the constitutionalists were royalists. This damaged the constitutionalists' popularity. The idea behind the strong talk of overthrowing the Qing emperor was actually strong Han nationalism. By advocating Han nationalism and causing tensions between the Han and Manchurians, revolutionaries would have a chance to overthrow the Qing government. The Qing government only cared about the interests of the Manchurians. Rumor had it that the Qing government would rather give the country to foreigners than give it back to the Han people they ruled. On the surface, the constitutionalists and the revolutionaries were opponents. But these two forces actually influenced each other. For instance, when the constitutionalists tried to convince the government to introduce a reform, they would argue that such a reform could silence the appeals of the revolutionaries. To respond to the movement for a constitution, the Qing government was forced to announce the establishment of the Constitutional Preparation Program in 1906. In 1909, consultative boards were set up in different provinces. In 1910, an advisory committee was set up in the central government. For the first time, the Chinese people experienced parliamentary politics. The consultative board was similar to a provincial assembly today. The advisory committee was more or less a temporary parliament. Both allowed the people to see the parliamentary system at work. In early 20th century China, education was not universal and many were illiterate. The election for the consultative board required candidates and voters to have education and property, so very few people took part in this first ever democratic process. Only about 0.4% of the population had the right to vote. That means if China had 0.5 billion people at the time, only 2 million people could vote. Despite the fact that problems including inaccurate voter lists, proxy voting, and bribery occurred during the election, China had made its first step toward democracy. An election was the first sign of democracy, and the consultative board was the first ever election in China.
有选票。
However, the Qing government did not really want any reform. In May 1911, the list of cabinet members was released by the Qing government. Among the 13 members, 8 of them were Manchurians, and 5 were members of the royal family. The constitutionalists despaired, and the revolutionaries became the mainstream.
知道中国大部分人都是汉人呢，
Most people in China were Han.
不愿意把政权开放给大家嘛。
They felt the Qing government did not want to let go of their power.
所以这个时候
So nationalism grew stronger among the Han people.
强起来。
精英主义比较更容易体
Radical approaches can easily heighten contradictions of society, and a big conflict was often more easily accepted by the public.
是最容易为群众所
This is why every time there is a public movement, usually the most radical measure will be taken.
的这种办法。
The fuel for revolution was hidden everywhere in China. The only thing that was missing was the match. In May 1911, the Qing troops in Hubei were transferred to Sichuan to suppress people protesting against nationalization of the railway. Half the troops who stayed were actually revolutionaries. On October 10th, Xiong Bing-kun of the revolutionary group Gongjin Association led an uprising, and the Revolutionary Army took over Wuchang. This was the revolution of 1911 that gave birth to the Republic of China. Soon after the revolution, various provinces declared independence. In addition to the revolutionaries, the constitutionalists, who had local influence, were key in terms of encouraging provinces to support the revolution.
你像谭延闿，
A good example was the speaker of the consultative board in Hunan, Tan Yan-kai. During the revolution in 1911, he successfully persuaded government officials of Hunan province to support the revolution.
中间那个就是。
The constitutionalists were realistic. They knew that the tide of revolution couldn't be stopped. That was why they accepted the idea of a republic. They weren't opportunists, as some might think. When Yuan Shikai wanted to restore the monarchy, the constitutionalists didn't support him. Provincial representatives of the revolutionaries in the south elected Sun Yat-sen provisional president. On January 1st, 1912, Sun Yat-sen assumed office and announced that the Republic of China was officially established in Nanjing, and that the Nanjing Provisional Government would be a presidential system. The Qing government in the north was forced to rely on Yuan Shikai to suppress the revolutionary movement. With massive troops under his command, Yuan could attack the south at any minute. Jiang Jian, an important leader of the constitutionalists, became key to easing the tension between north and south.
袁世凯在满清末年是一个非常有作为
Yuan Shikai was an important official in the Qing government.
阶级的人，他已经头角，
He was a famous leader.
所以大家都知道他。那么张骞跟
Jiang Jian was an old friend of his.
跟他是有这个
Jiang went to talk to Yuan and tried to ease the
跟
situation.
他去联系，这个稳定形势。
南北谈判呢，有个关键
One key issue during the negotiation was the president of the new country.
党未了结的，
Finally, the two parties agreed that Yuan would become the president,
清朝皇
and they also agreed to give the emperor good payment after his resignation. Under the premise that Sun Yat-sen would resign from his position as the president, 42 generals under Yuan sent a joint telegraph to the Qing government and urged the government to change the country into a republic. On February 12, 1912, Empress Dowager Long Yu announced the resignation of Emperor Xuantong and ended the rule of the Qing dynasty after 268 years. Three days later, Yuan was elected the second provisional president. Members of the Nanjing Provisional Government, including Sun Yat-sen, had considered the possibility of controlling Yuan. They were worried that if Yuan couldn't be controlled, all their efforts for the revolution would be in vain. Hence, the provisional government decided to pass the provisional constitution and change the presidential system to a parliamentary system. They also asked Yuan to assume office in Nanjing so as to remove him from his power in Beijing. When Tsai Yuen-pei led the delegation to welcome Yuan, a military coup d'etat occurred in Beijing for no obvious reason. Yuan thus said that the situation in the north was not stable and refused to go to Nanjing. Consequently, on March 10, 1912, Yuan assumed office as provisional president in Beijing. With the joint efforts of the constitutionalists, the revolutionaries, and the military forces, monarchy was ended in China and a republic was founded. After the republic was founded, a parliamentary election was held according to the Provisional Constitution. This was the first time that the Republic of China could elect a parliament that would make decisions about state policies, so many political parties were formed. The Revolutionary Alliance and other groups formed the Kuomintang or KMT. The acting chairman, Song Jiaoran, was very keen about party politics, and he hoped the KMT could get enough seats to form the duty cabinet. Constitutionalists formed the Progressive Party, led by Liang Qichao, which was inclined to support President Yuan Shikai. A bipartisan system was formed at the beginning of the Republic. There was an aggressive party and a moderate party. In China's political history, such a bipartisan system was perfect. How did a country that had just abandoned its old custom and cut its queue elect its parliament members? According to law, the parliament included the Senate and House of Representatives. Senators were to be elected by the Provisional Assembly, congressmen directly by voters. Only men 25 years or older possessing one of the following three requirements could run. First, he had paid more than $2 of annual tax. Second, he possessed property worth more than $500. Third, he had an elementary or equivalent educational qualification. Requirements for voters were similar to those for candidates, with the only exception that voters should be men over 21 years old. Due to gender limitations and the illiteracy rate, most people were not qualified to vote. In 1913, only 10% of the Republic of China's population were qualified voters. At the time, voters were required to write down the names of the candidates before they cast the ballots. So a person who was illiterate wouldn't be able to vote. In the early 20th century, household registration was not common in China, so it was extremely difficult to conduct a voter census. According to a news article, most censuses were done carelessly. Omissions and false or repeated reports were common. Another article reported that when a county magistrate in Gansu province received the official document about election officers, xuanjuren, he thought the government was asking him to elect a juren to participate in the Qing imperial examinations. Election officers were people who organized elections. A county magistrate in Gansu province received this official document about election officers and mistook xuanjuren as meaning to elect juren to join the imperial examination. He replied and said his country was not well developed, so he couldn't find anyone who was qualified to be a juren. This became a joke. Despite all these flaws, mistakes, and even jokes, these were all precious democratic experiences for the Republic. In the first parliamentary election, The KMT won the majority of votes in both the Senate and House of Representatives. So acting chairman Song Jiaoren was expected to become premier. President Yuan, however, was not pleased with this possibility. On the night of March 20th, 1913, Song was assassinated at the Shanghai rail station, and there was speculation that Yuan had pulled the strings. The sudden death of Song killed the possibility of party politics and cast a shadow over the Chinese democracy movement. Since it was impossible to promote party politics through peaceful democratic processes, the KMT had to start another revolution and overthrow Yuan by force. In July 1913, the Second Revolution was started by Sun Yat-sen, but they were defeated by Yuan within 2 months. The failure of the Second Revolution gave Yuan an excuse to attack democracy. He gave an order to dissolve the KMT and the parliament and abolished the Provisional Constitution. He then introduced the new Constitution of the Republic of China and changed the parliamentary system into a presidential system to allow the president to run for re-election. Still, this new constitution couldn't satisfy Yuan's ambition to become emperor. Moreover, as a result of the political chaos, scholars at home and abroad started to re-examine if a republic system was suitable for China. At that time, some said that China needed an emperor rather than a republic system. Even some Western political scientists, like Frank J. Goodnow, felt this way. In 1915, Yuan schemed to proclaim himself emperor and changed the name of the era in the following year. Such an act led to widespread opposition in China. Even generals Feng Guozhang and Duan Qirui, who had been promoted by Yuan, opposed him. Various provinces in China declared independence, and even Liang Qichao, who had been willing to work with Yuan, strongly opposed the idea of resuming the monarchy. In Liang Qichao's view, there was no reason to resume the monarchy, since the republic had already been founded. He believed that a great change of the state system was just like a revolution, so he opposed Yuan's idea. Instead, he hoped that reform could be introduced gradually under the status quo. Yuan's reign lasted only 83 days. Not long after, Yuan passed away due to illness. Then, in 1917, the warlord Zhang Xun initiated the Manchu Restoration and failed. The attempt was like a farce that ended in chaos. Thereafter, nobody ever again had the ambition to become emperor. China had bid farewell to monarchy, and there was no going back. In 1918, the second parliamentary election was held in China. Premier Duan Qirui's follower Xu Shuzheng manipulated the election through bribery, and various problems in democratic elections were highlighted. In 1923, the warlord Cao Kun got himself elected as the president through bribery. Members of parliament were nicknamed piglets by the public. More than a decade had passed since the republic's founding, but the road to democracy was still a long one. It wasn't possible that our practice of democracy would be perfect from the very beginning. It was just like a person learning to eat crab. He wouldn't look good or even elegant when he first started. But it was necessary to take that first step. The chaotic situation in the Republic was even worse than that during the late Qing. This was unbearable for the father of the revolution, Sun Yat-sen. By 1915 and 1916, sure that the revolution of 1911 had failed, Sun wanted to form a new group of revolutionaries and establish a new republic with force. When Sun first initiated the revolution against Yuan Shikai, he had no followers. People who had fought with him in the first revolution, like Huang Xing and Chen Zhongming, either tried not to take charge or even simply refused to join the action. Most people didn't see the reason to fight again, since the Republic had been founded. Sun was desperate to remove obstacles to democracy and to find supporters. In 1914, he founded the Chinese Revolutionary Party in Japan, which required members to obey the orders given by its leader. Obedience was more important than the pursuit of democracy. All members were required to put fingerprints on their application forms and swear that they would follow the orders of Sun. They were not allowed to disobey his orders. Sun's approach was actually what he learned when he had interactions with the Chinese secret society. The key concept was to control members through layers of constraint. Unfortunately, this approach was not effective. In 1917, Sun established a military government in Guangzhou, but the actual power was in the hands of the local warlords. Countries in the West were reluctant to support his revolutionary work.
We can say that Sun Yat-sen had experienced numerous setbacks. He tried to apply for loans, but no country would give him money. Sun was isolated in the international arena. At the same time, the violent methods of the Russian communists also led to the isolation of the Soviet Union. Big powers in the West, as well as the Social Democratic Labour Party of the Second International, all disagreed with such a radical approach.
Hence, the Soviet Union and Communist International sent Leo Karakan, G. Maring, and Adolf A. Joffe to contact Sun. Sun thus faced a dilemma between choosing Western powers or the Soviet Union. The rebellions of Chen Zhongming in 1922, however, led Sun to decide to work with the Soviet Union.
After June 1922, Sun chose to work with the Soviet Union. An envoy from the Soviet Union promised that the Soviet Union would provide him with financial assistance.
On January 26, 1923, Sun and Joffe announced the Sun-Joffe Manifesto, which stated that Sun would receive assistance from Lenin and the Communist International to regain momentum for revolution and to reorganize the KMT. In fact, Sun did not just receive funding and weapons from the Soviet Union, he also learned to form a strong political party.
Sun once said, "He will learn from the Russians." He was actually referring to the way the Russian communists organized their party.
The Communist International sent Mikhail Markovich Borodin to help Sun reorganize the KMT via Russian communist methods.
Iron discipline was established in the party, and constraints were applied to control members' speech and thoughts. In short, once the party had decided the guiding policy, the party members could not oppose. For a loose organization like the KMT, such iron discipline was necessary for a certain period of time.
On January 20th, 1924, the KMT held its first national conference at Guangzhou. The Chinese Communist Party had not recruited many members, and some of their members joined the KMT individually. Mao Zedong was one of them. Sun was reluctant to accept communists into his party because he did not want class struggle. He wanted a single-party state. Basically, the KMT and the Chinese Communists shared the same origin. Both parties followed the patterns of the Russian Communists, rather than Anglo-American-style parties. Sun's concept of rule by party did not come from the Soviet Union. It was already there when he first established the Chinese Revolutionary Party. However, he was not able to put it into action until he learnt about party organization from the Russians. The KMT was finally able to become a political organization that could practice rule by party. Sun believed that a single-party state should be realized step by step. In 1906, when Sun announced the declaration of military government, He proposed a three-step process to reconstruct the country, which included rule of military law, rule of provisional constitution, and rule of constitution.
建国大纲第6条里说，军政时期的一切制度完全属。
In 1924, Sun formally divided the process of founding the state into three periods: military government, political tutelage, and constitutional government. In his view, the country was divided by warlords in various provinces, and military action was necessary to clear obstacles to revolution. So a military government was necessary during this period. When the country was reunited, the next step was to teach the people how to exercise the four civil rights: election, recall, initiative, and referendum. This would be the period of political tutelage. The goal was to ensure that the revolution had been carried out according to the agenda. When most citizens had learned about citizenship in a democracy, it was then time to enter the period of constitutional government. The political turmoil at the beginning of the Republic led Sun to re-examine whether the democratic system was suitable for China. His conclusion was that China must practice democracy. However, since the country had just ended its monarchy, he proposed the concept of political tutelage to teach the people the practice of democracy. In 1925, Sun Yat-sen passed away. The national government was founded in Guangzhou. In 1928, the Northern Expedition succeeded and the country was unified. This would mean the end of military government and the beginning of political tutelage. On October 3rd, the KMT Central Standing Committee passed the program for a phase of political tutelage proposed by Hu Hanmin and Sun Fo and started to enforce the principle of rule by party. The KMT's National Conference would exercise the power of politics on behalf of the National Assembly, and the 5 powers of governance would be assumed by the national government. The national government would exercise executive power, but would answer to the KMT's Central Executive Committee. What is meant by rule by party? Hu Hanmin said it very frankly. All authority was concentrated in the party, and the KMT was the only one in charge. Hence, in 1929, during the 3rd KMT National Conference, a resolution was passed to use Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles of the people as the highest fundamental law for the Republic of China during the period of political tutelage. This was, of course, unacceptable for some intellectuals, especially those who had received training about democracy in the West. This resolution basically said the KMT would be the nanny, and thousands of millions of Chinese were just infants who needed to be nurtured and educated to become adults. There was no way that the other political parties would accept this. Several political forces in China wanted to have a provisional constitution. One force was led by intellectuals like Hu Shi. The other by the bourgeoisie in Shanghai. They all argued that the country must have a provisional constitution. In 1930, local warlords and Chiang Kai-shek had conflicts over disarmament. In addition to the military issue, the issue of whether a provisional constitution should be drafted was used by both parties to attract support from intellectuals. During the conflicts, anti-Jiang warlords gathered a group of scholars and experts to draft the Provisional Constitution of Taiyuan, which was praised by many after it was released. Through the conflicts, Jiang felt pressure to draft a provisional constitution. So, towards the end of the conflicts, he sent a telegraph and asked the KMT to hold a plenary session of the Central Committee after the conflicts were ended, and to discuss drafting of the provisional constitution.
决定了要制定约法。
Jiang really needed the support of liberal intellectuals, so he had to respond to their appeal for a provisional constitution. Jiang followed through and accepted ideas from intellectuals like Hu Shi to draft a provisional constitution. However, Hu Hanmin, president of the Legislative Yuan, insisted that Sun Yat-sen's writings were equivalent to a constitution. The two thus had a serious confrontation. Hu Hanmin was trying to use the Legislative Yuan to control Jiang's power. Hu was against Jiang's authoritarian style. He insisted on authoritarian rule of the party, in other words, political tutelage. On February 28, 1931, Jiang invited Hu to a dinner party, at which the two had a fierce debate. On the following day, Jiang gave an order for Hu to be put under house arrest. Jiang wanted to draft a provisional constitution, and he was trying to move the country from the period of rule by party to rule by law. This was something that should be recognized. However, when he had disagreements with Hu, instead of using a democratic way to resolve their differences, he chose an authoritarian approach to handle it. In May 1931, the National Assembly was held under KMT leadership. The Provisional Constitution during the period of political tutelage was passed, laying the foundation for the legitimacy of the system. The period of political tutelage allowed the KMT to guide and supervise the national government. It would also promote local self-government, training people to exercise their political rights and become citizens of democratic society. However, the invasion of Japan after the Mukden incident and activities of the Chinese communists near the middle reaches of the Yangtze River made it difficult to promote local self-government.
Japan's honor had been violated. In half an hour, the Japanese railroad garrison...
After September 18, 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. China again faced the threat of invasion. Nationalism overwhelmed the pursuit of democracy. As it tried to save itself from elimination, China started to notice how, in Europe, Italy had changed from a weak country into a strong power within a short time. During the Great Depression, many countries, including capitalist countries, had suffered. However, Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union were able to develop their economy quickly through authoritarian means. Mussolini attracted the attention of the Chinese because he was able to turn a poor and chaotic Italy into a strong country within 5 to 6 years. In the 1930s, fascism was very popular around the world. The movement to worship dictators and nationalism overthrew the democratic tradition of the West. However, there was actually no theoretical foundation for so-called fascism. The first feature of fascism was probably that it was against communism, and it used violent measures to fight against communists. The second feature was that it was probably anti-democracy and anti-parliament. The third, and the most important feature, was that it came with extreme nationalism. Back in 1923, Dongfang magazine had published an article using fascism to save China. People in the KMT began talking about using fascism to practice the 3 principles of the people. Some people proposed using the 3 principles of the people as the principle, and using fascism for actual measures. In other words, we would have a Chinese version of fascism that was led by the KMT. It would be based on the 3 principles of the people, and most importantly, it would use fascism for the actual measures. Chiang Kai-shek's response to this appeal in the KMT provided food for thought. He was very cautious about whether or not China should adopt fascism. When Chiang first talked about fascism in 1931, he said that fascism was very effective and it could be used to reach certain goals. However, Chiang felt that European fascism did not fit in with the world of great harmony spirit promoted by the Chinese. In private, however, Chiang had a different attitude. In 1931, some of Wangpo Military Academy's first graduates felt the country was in great danger. But Academy President Chiang's leadership was under constant challenge. The graduates, including Deng Wenyi, formed a secret society to help Chiang become absolute leader and save China. My father, Deng Wenyi, was Chiang Kai-shek's secretary at that time. He told Chiang about their intention to form the secret society. Chiang agreed, so they formed the Lixing Society. What the Lixing Society did was quite obvious. They imitated the fascists and the Nazis. The mission given to the Lixing cadres by Chiang was simple. They were to conduct political training, particularly thought training on one leader, one belief. From this angle, I think the secret society did help Chiang to accumulate his political influence. If China wanted to be united, they needed to have a leader. For people in the Lixing Society, the absolute choice was Chiang. The people under Chiang wanted to follow the approaches in Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. For instance, a slogan in the New Life movement, "Sun, Air, Water," actually came from Italy. The New Life movement set up by Chiang since 1934 was very popular all over China, but very few people knew that the Lixing Society was behind it. The secrecy of the Lixing Society also led to a variety of misunderstandings and myths. Some mistook the Lixing Society for the Blue Shirt Society, similar to the Black Shirts in Italy. Hence, when they talked about the influence of the Lixing Society, they talked mainly about their performance as secret agents. The people from Lixing Society, who were secret agents later, included Dai Li and Kang Ze. The Lixing Society helped Chiang train a group of loyal cadres who could get the job done. The political arena in China followed their example, creating a chain reaction. All political forces in China were trying to use fascism. The CC clique of the KMT also formed the Qingbai Society, and even anti-Chiang forces started to learn about fascism. The local warlords in Guangxing and Sichuan formed their own fascist organizations. We could say that the 1930s was a time when fascism was popularized in China. Fascism's appeal was not limited to China's military and political figures. Intellectuals were also undergoing an internal revolution. Many liberals like Jiang Tingfu and Ding Wanjiang turned to fascism during the debate about democracy and authoritarianism. Jiang Tingfu, who studied at Columbia University, believed that China's development was way behind. China had to go through an authoritarian period to effectively modernize. Ding Wanjiang, a geology student in Britain, proposed a new form of authoritarianism. Because of illiteracy, elections were not an option in China. The country was in grave danger, and democracy couldn't save the country in time. Ding once said, compared with the Belarusians who went into exile in Paris because their country had been taken over, he would rather stay in Moscow and be a geologist because the Soviet Union had hope for the future. Both Jiang Tingfu and Ding Wenjiang were patriotic. The reason they moved to support authoritarianism was because China was in a really difficult situation. Japan was ready to invade. Gu Shi, the representative of the liberal intellectuals, was not comfortable with such a development. He believed China should continue on the path of constitutional democracy. Democracy was a young political system, suitable for training a nation that lacked political experience. Democracy was the most fundamental form of politics. In Europe or in the US, people can simply draw a circle or cross to express their opinion. The debate in China between democracy and authoritarianism continued in the 1930s. Just as China was about to end the period of political tutelage and become a constitutional democratic country, the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937. In 1938, to unite the country, the KMT announced it would form the Political Participation Council of Nationals with other parties, which would become the highest public consultation institution during the war. Its most popular slogan was, "Constitutional democracy for the war against Japan." However, the pressure of the war again delayed the country's steps towards constitutional democracy. In 1945, Japan surrendered. While everyone celebrated the end of the war, they also needed to begin reconstruction from the ashes. There was also tension between the KMT and the communists that had to be dealt with. To answer to the appeal for peaceful reconstruction and governmental reorganization, Chiang Kai-shek, chairman of the national government, called Mao Zedong chairman of the Chinese Communist Party 3 times and invited him to hold negotiations in Chongqing.
Since the killings and uprisings of 1927.
On October 10th, both parties signed an agreement stating that the period of political tutelage should end and constitutional democracy begin at once. The KMT and the Communists also decided to hold the Political Consultative Conference to discuss political arrangements related to the Constitution. Basically, this conference was outside the system. One of its goals was to reach a national consensus for peaceful reconstruction. The Political Consultative Conference was held under international influence. In Sun Yat-sen's plan, the period of political tutelage would last only 6 years. Now, nearly 20 years had passed. There was no reason not to move into the period of constitutional democracy. In January 1946, the Political Consultative Conference was attended by the KMT, Communists, China Democratic League, China Youth Party, and intellectuals. The team in charge of drafting the Constitution was responsible for revising the May 5th Constitution draft to be the foundation for the new Constitution. Their job was to change a Constitution draft recognized by the KMT into one acceptable for all parties. A resolution at the conference required an absolute majority vote, or 4/5 of the votes. Basically, all parties had to agree. The May 5th Constitution draft was announced on May 5th, 1936. Basically, it was designed according to Sun Yat-sen's 5-power constitution. The most important feature was the National Assembly, the only institution directly elected by the people. The other 4 civil rights, including election, recall, initiative, and referendum, were directly exercised by the National Assembly, not the people. As for the system of government, with the exception of the executive yuan that would answer to the president, the other 4 yuans, including the legislative, judicial, examination, and control yuan, as well as the president, would all answer to the National Assembly. The premier would be appointed by the president, so he would answer to the president. Hence, executive power lay with the president. Even though the president would answer to the National Assembly would hold one meeting every 3 years, so there were no effective checks on executive power. The feature of the 5 yuans was division of labor, not checks and balances, so the executive yuan had to answer to the president. On the other hand, even though the National Assembly enjoyed the highest power, it was not a permanent institution, so it could not really limit the power of the president. This led to a presidential system where the president would have the greatest power. This design lacked checks and balances, so it was not acceptable for anyone outside the KMT. After the war, most democratic parties supported Anglo-American style democracy. To win public support, the Chinese Communists agreed to abandon the Soviet system and accepted the Anglo-American style constitutional system with local self-government. The Political Consultative Conference thus focused on finding a balance between the 5-power and Anglo-American style constitutions. The KMT could not accept a new constitution that did not bear the ideas of Sun Yat-sen. Hence, Sun Fo, the son of Sun Yat-sen, argued that they would keep the 5-power format, but the details of each power could be discussed. There was now room for negotiation and compromise. With the efforts of Jiang Junmai, chairman of the China Democratic Socialist Party, the conference reached 12 conclusions on the revision of the May 5th Constitution draft. Crucial were the removal of the National Assembly's power and allowing the people to directly exercise the 4 civil rights. Legislators would be elected by the public. The legislative yuan would be like Congress in a Western democratic country. In the spirit of the parliamentary system, the executive yuan would answer to the legislative yuan. Each province could draft their provincial constitution and exercise self-government. Incorporating these principles, the May 5th Constitution draft was revised to resemble a Western democratic constitution. As the famous thinker Liang Shuming so wonderfully stated, Jiang Junmai had successfully kept the name of the 5-power constitution, yet injected the spirit of the Anglo-American style constitution. Unfortunately, the fact that the ideas of Sun Yat-sen were not fully implemented in the new constitution led to opposition inside the KMT. The KMT didn't support the conclusions passed by its own representatives at the conference. Even Chiang Kai-shek felt that these principles would reduce the power of the president. The massive revision of the May 5th Constitution draft was displeasing for many people in the KMT. Ultimately, Chiang Kai-shek was the one who calmed them down. In April 1946, Jiang Junmai drafted the new constitution draft according to the principles agreed upon at the Political Consultative Conference. However, the KMT and Communists changed their minds again. The two parties disagreed with the content of the new draft, and they also wanted to reserve the right to make more revisions of the principles agreed on at the conference. Jiang Junmai thus said that the new draft could be thrown away. In November 1946, the National Constituent Assembly was held in Nanjing, yet the Communists and the Democratic League did not want to attend. The Anti-Communist Youth Party was willing to attend, but they did not want to be the only opposition party present. So the Democratic Socialist Party of Jiang Junmai became the critical few. In fact, if Chiang Kai-shek wanted to pass any constitution, he only needed members of the KMT to do it. But Jiang wanted to gain support from democratic countries like the US by showing that he supported democracy, so he wanted other parties to attend the assembly. The Youth Party had agreed, but they wanted the Democratic Socialist Party to take part as well. Jiang Junmai agreed, but he wanted Jiang's promise in writing that the new constitution would be drafted according to the principles agreed on at the Political Consultative Conference. Jiang reached an agreement with Zhang and promised that as long as the Democratic Socialist Party attended the assembly, Jiang's draft would be passed. Jiang Junmai decided to attend the assembly. The KMT, Democratic Socialist Party, and Youth Party were about to draft the new constitution. But KMT representatives tried to change the resolution, and Jiang threatened to withdraw from the assembly with his entire party. The new constitution was again mired in stalemate. Chiang Kai-shek was concerned that if all the other parties left the assembly, it would mean that the KMT had failed politically. So he supported Jiang Junmai and told the representatives of the KMT to stop arguing. Jiang invited representatives of the KMT to a dinner party and persuaded everyone to accept Jiang's draft. Without Chiang Kai-shek's support, it wouldn't have passed. Jiang Junmai also tried to convince representatives of the opposition parties to keep certain KMT-sponsored articles, to close the gap between the parties. The three principles of the people would have to be mentioned to satisfy the KMT, so Jiang convinced everyone that it was necessary to add these expressions because it recognized the efforts of the KMT in establishing the republic and drafting the constitution, but didn't affect the actual political system. On December 25, 1946, the Constitution of the Republic of China, based on the draft agreed upon at the Political Consultative Conference, was finally passed. It was officially enacted on December 25th the following year. It had been 35 years in the making. During the process, from drafting to negotiation to final passage, Jiang Junmai had played an important role. Some scholars thus joked that this new constitution was Jiang's constitution. This, of course, was an exaggeration, but it did show Jiang's importance in giving birth to the constitution. The constitution was based on the draft agreed upon at the Political Consultative Conference and was accepted by all parties in China at that time. This meant that this constitution was the only constitution that had been recognized by all parties in China. The Constitution basically adopted the principle of constitutional protection of basic human rights, instead of the protection of law adopted by the old May 5th Constitution draft. This was a big improvement in terms of human rights protection. Basically, the Constitution met the criteria for a modern constitution. It is quite progressive compared with some other constitutions. Even though the Constitution kept the National Assembly, its power had been reduced to the presidential election and amendment of the Constitution. And even though the framework of 5 yuans was kept, the spirit of checks and balances from the West had been included. The president was expected to find someone who can follow his policy to be the premier, and this person would answer to the legislative yuan. Such an approach is helpful for stability of the political situation. Constitutionally speaking, this was called a dual parliamentary system. It was not clear whether the new constitution was a parliamentary or presidential system, so Chiang Kai-shek was reluctant to take part in the presidential election. He thought about asking Hu Shi to run instead, but the KMT opposed. Believing the power of the president would be strengthened, Jiang took part in the presidential election.
民国37年3月选举第1任总统，选举结果，蒋中正先生以压倒多数当选，成为中华民国宪政史上的第1任总统。
Jiang was reluctant to participate in the presidential election because he was concerned about the power of the president. To solve this problem, the temporary provisions effective during the period of communist rebellion was passed as an addition to the Constitution. Some people felt that to solve the possible conflicts between the temporary provisions and the Constitution, the power of the president had to be strengthened. This, however, led to a new problem. On April 18, 1948, the National Assembly passed the temporary provisions effective during the period of communist rebellion, according to the procedures of constitutional amendment. The provisions gave the president the power of emergency decree that did not need to be ratified by the legislative yuan. Later, more amendments were added to freeze the constitution. the Constitution only recently enacted was restrained by a series of temporary provisions.
49年，总统用全民一致的请求第二次连任。
However, it was a fact that the Republic of China had enacted its constitution. This constitution later became the most powerful tool for people to challenge the interim institution. With this constitution in place, the Republic of China on Taiwan could finally declare that the country was a constitutional democracy. The opposition could also use the constitution as the foundation to ask the government to follow the constitution. More or less, this constitution contributed to the democratization of Taiwan. After decades, our predecessors' dream of pursuing democracy was finally realized when the Constitution was made according to contemporary democratic principles. It was unfortunate that their dream was not realized in China, but various coincidences allowed Taiwan to become a constitutional democracy.